The sun sank low over the cotton fields of Georgia, painting the land in shades of burnt gold and shadow. Thomas Whitaker stood by the fence, watching his twin daughters, Eliza and Margaret, chase each other through the dusty yard. Their laughter, bright and unrestrained, sliced through the heavy afternoon air, and yet, beneath that sound, Thomas felt a hollow ache he could not name. He had spent years building this farm, working until his hands were raw and his back a map of old scars, but debt had clawed its way in like a silent predator, leaving him trapped. The letter that had arrived that morning rested on the table back in the house, inked words promising salvation, yet carrying a weight that made his chest tighten and stomach turn. The girls ran back toward him, faces glowing with the thrill of play, tiny hands clutching handfuls of wildflowers and strands of honeysuckle. "Papa, look what we found," Eliza called, thrusting a bright yellow bloom toward him. Margaret, ever curious, crouched to examine a beetle, her dark curls falling over her eyes as she giggled. Thomas forced a smile, nodding. Even though each sound of their joy felt like a hammer striking his chest, he could see them as they were. Innocent, trusting, alive. But he also saw the impossible choice that awaited him. The offer in the letter would clear his debts, keep the farm, and protect his pride. But it demanded something unbearable in return: the girls themselves. That night, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the letter splayed before him, candlelight flickering against the walls. Mr. Caldwell, a wealthy planter from Savannah, wrote with a courteous tone that barely masked his authority, offering to take Eliza and Margaret as apprentices. They would learn, he promised, and in exchange, Thomas would receive enough money to lift the mortgage and secure his future. The words were seductive in their practicality, yet Thomas knew the truth. Apprenticeship in the Caldwell household was not kindness. It was a gilded cage. He had heard whispers from neighboring counties. Girls sent to Savannah rarely returned the same, many disappearing into harsh servitude, their spirits broken under rigid discipline and cold authority. Thomas traced the ink with shaking fingers, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple, and for the first time, fear clawed at him in the way hunger and debt never had. Sleep offered no relief. Thomas lay on his narrow mattress, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling of his bedroom, imagining the girls' tiny faces pressed against the Caldwell windows, longing for home. He remembered the day they had learned to walk, how Eliza had wobbled across the floor, and Margaret had tried to copy her, arms flailing, eyes wide with determination. He remembered their mother, long gone, urging him to protect them, to teach them the world but never let it break them. And now the very hands he had promised to guard them with would write their fate into servitude. Each imagined scolding, each imagined punishment landed on him with the weight of a hammer. His stomach churned, bile rising at the thought. He was their father, yet he was betraying them, for a promise of security he feared was already hollow. Morning came grey and thick, the sky bruised with clouds. Thomas dressed in his worn coat, heart heavy, and led the girls to the front yard where a polished carriage waited. The driver's boots clomped against the dirt path, echoing like a countdown. Mr. Caldwell stepped down, a tall man with an impeccably straight posture and a gaze that seemed to measure the world in profit and obedience. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," he said, voice smooth but icy. "Your daughters are ready to join my household?" Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He knelt, lifting Eliza into his arms, then Margaret, pressing them close to his chest, inhaling the scent of their hair, the faint musk of childhood that would soon be stripped away. "Papa," Eliza whispered, clinging to him, "we'll write letters, won't we?" Margaret's small hand gripped his coat, eyes wide with unspoken questions. Thomas kissed their foreheads, forcing a reassuring tone that cracked with every syllable. "Yes, my loves, letters every week. I'll be waiting." The words were a lie, but the only shield he could offer against the chasm of fear in their faces. The carriage lurched forward, wheels crunching against the dirt, and Thomas felt his heart fracture with each turn away from the house, from the life he had promised them, from the innocence he had no right to trade. The days following their departure were a torment of silence and sporadic letters. Each note from the Caldwell household, penned in perfect cursive, was meticulous, polite, and distant. They mentioned lessons completed, chores finished, and minor accomplishments. But beneath the words ran a cold undercurrent that Thomas could not ignore. One letter described Eliza being scolded for speaking out of turn during sewing lessons. Another mentioned Margaret hiding a book and receiving solitary confinement. Thomas' chest tightened with every line, guilt clawing deeper than hunger, fear, or loss ever had. He walked through the empty nursery, touching the small bedsheet still pressed into the mattress, the tiny shoes neatly lined by the door, imagining the girl's small, trembling hands longing for him. Storms came and went, each one a cruel reminder of his decision. When a hurricane ripped through the county, tearing at the roof of the barn and flooding the lowlands, Thomas found himself praying. Not for the farm, not for his own survival, but for his daughters. He imagined them shivering in a strange household, punished for mistakes he could not prevent. Sleep became impossible. Dreams were haunted by their faces, their eyes wide with confusion and pain, whispers of "Papa" echoing in the dark. The farm, once a source of pride and stability, now felt like a mausoleum of choices, too heavy to bear. Weeks turned into months. Thomas became a shadow of the man he had been, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling as he worked. He avoided neighbors, couldn't meet their eyes without seeing the reflection of his own betrayal staring back. He tried to immerse himself in the farm, but every crop harvested, every fence mended, every animal fed was tainted with the memory of the girls he had sold. Even the sound of laughter, children passing along the road, birds calling from the trees, felt like a cruel echo of what he had destroyed. And always there was the letters, distant, precise, cold, a reminder that he could not undo what he had done. Regret settled into Thomas's bones, a constant companion, sharper than any creditor's demand or threat. He realized that the wealth he had clawed for, the survival he had secured, was meaningless against the knowledge of the pain he had caused. He had traded his daughter's innocence for his pride, their love for his convenience, and no measure of money or survival could restore it. Sometimes he found himself staring out across the cotton fields, imagining the carriage returning with the girls, imagining their small faces pressing against the window, and feeling a hollow ache that would never leave him. In those quiet hours, Thomas whispered apologies into the wind, knowing they would not carry. He wondered if they would ever forgive him, or if the very air between them had been poisoned by his decision. And though life around him continued, the farm prospered, and neighbors occasionally nodded in approval, Thomas felt only the heavy, inescapable weight of regret, a burden that would follow him every waking hour until the end of his days. Eliza and Margaret arrived at the Caldwell estate with the same wide-eyed curiosity that had defined their childhood, but it was quickly swallowed by the cold. Imposing halls of the Savannah mansion, the grand wooden doors seemed to close behind them with finality, echoing in a way that made their small hearts pound. Mr. Caldwell greeted them with a nod, his eyes scanning them not as children but as investments, tools to be shaped, molded and disciplined to his liking. The girls clung to each other instinctively, their fingers intertwined as if the connection alone could shield them from what awaited. The first few days were a blur of rules and chores. They were taught to polish silverware until it shone, scrub floors until their knees were raw, and memorize lists of etiquette that seemed designed to crush the spirit rather than educate. Any mistake brought sharp words or a cold glare, and on one occasion, Margaret was ordered to kneel in the corner for an entire afternoon for spilling water while filling a basin. The girls whispered to each other at night in the small attic room where they slept, sharing their fears in hushed tones. But even their secret conversations carried a tremor of uncertainty. The world outside the Caldwell gates felt impossibly distant, and every passing day chipped away at the innocence Thomas had tried to preserve. Back on the Whitaker farm, Thomas could not eat, could not sleep. Each day without news felt like a century, and when letters arrived, they brought more pain than relief. One described Eliza's hands blistered from scrubbing floors. Another detailed Margaret's trembling as she knelt beneath the watchful eye of Mrs. Caldwell. Thomas's chest constricted with every word. He had imagined hardship, yes, but he had never imagined cruelty that would embed itself so deeply into the hearts of the girls he had sworn to protect. At night he wandered the empty house, touching the spaces where their laughter had once been, imagining the cold hands of the Caldwell servants gripping theirs, the stern faces towering over them, and he shivered with a combination of guilt and fear. The first winter brought its own horrors. Savannah was harsher than Georgia, the wind cutting through the walls of the Caldwell home like a blade. The girls were given thin blankets, insufficient for the bitter nights, and their small bodies shook beneath the quilts. They longed for the warmth of their father's hearth, the familiarity of home, but those comforts were gone, traded away for Thomas's survival. Each night Eliza whispered to Margaret about the farm, about the cotton fields and the small creek where they had played. Margaret, though quieter, would nod, clutching her sister, as if their shared memory could act as armor against the relentless cold. In those months, the girls began to understand the depth of their father's betrayal. Letters from Thomas were rare, often delayed by weeks, and when they arrived, they carried the scent of the farm, of distant grass and soil, but lacked the warmth they had known. The girls felt abandoned, not only by circumstance, but by the man who had once promised to protect them. Margaret especially began to internalize the cruelty, wondering silently why their father had chosen money over love. Eliza, though younger in spirit, was not immune. Her laughter faded, replaced by quiet, cautious smiles that masked fear. The Caldwell household thrived on this transformation, rewarding obedience, punishing emotion, and teaching lessons that were remembered more in fear than in understanding. Thomas, meanwhile, sank deeper into obsession. He spent hours staring at the letter he had signed, the paper yellowed at the edges, imagining the girls' small faces pressed against the mansion windows. He walked the cotton fields aimlessly, muttering apologies into the wind, feeling the weight of the decision crushing him with each passing day. He had traded safety for cruelty, and the realization ate at him with a sharp, relentless hunger. His friends spoke of the farm's prosperity, of his clever handling of debt, but Thomas could not hear them. The money was meaningless, the security was hollow. The echo of Eliza's laughter, now tainted with fear, haunted him more than any creditor or neighbor could. Months turned into a year, and the Caldwell household began to reveal its darker sides. Eliza had learned to hide her tears behind polite smiles, while Margaret's quiet defiance grew into small acts of rebellion. She would sneak notes into the servants' quarters, whispering secrets about their treatment to anyone who would listen. Yet the risk was constant. One evening, Margaret's courage faltered when Mrs. Caldwell caught her passing a note. The punishment was severe. She was confined to the attic room for 3 days with only bread and water. Eliza, desperate to comfort her twin, stayed at the door, pressing her face to the thin wooden panel, listening to every sound, imagining the worst. Thomas's letters, when they arrived during this time, could not reach them fast enough, and even if they had, they offered no protection. The girls realized that their father's choice had rendered them powerless in ways he could never fix. Thomas began to write letters obsessively, pouring his guilt and fear onto paper, yet he never sent them. He could not bear to face the rejection he imagined from his daughters, nor the judgment of Mr. Caldwell. His days became consumed with the thought of their suffering, his nights restless with visions of their punishment. He began to notice changes in himself. His appetite disappeared, his hands shook even when they were clean, and every shadow seemed to whisper the consequences of his actions. He tried to find solace in tending the farm, but the work that once brought pride now felt mechanical, empty and meaningless. The land prospered without him, a cruel reflection of the life he had destroyed. One spring afternoon, news arrived from Savannah that shook Thomas to his core. A letter, sealed with the Caldwell crest, informed him that Eliza had fallen seriously ill from overwork and exposure. Her small body had been pushed beyond endurance, and she had collapsed while performing chores. The words struck Thomas like a blow to the chest, and he barely noticed the collapse of the barn roof during that same week. He had expected hardship, but the reality was a nightmare. Regret, previously a shadow in the corner of his mind, now consumed every thought. He wept alone in the fields, imagining the pain he had caused, feeling the cold distance between him and his daughters widen into an abyss he feared he could never cross. Meanwhile, Margaret's quiet rebellion grew bolder. She learned to memorize the daily routines of the household, noting the times when supervision waned, and she began to whisper messages to the other young apprentices. The Caldwell household, though imposing, had cracks, and Margaret sought them tirelessly. Eliza, still fragile from illness, leaned on her twin's cunning, finding small solace in shared strength. Yet every small victory carried risk, and every punishment reinforced the cruel reality that their father's decision had set them on a path lined with suffering. Thomas's mind wandered constantly to these possibilities, imagining the punishments, the loneliness, the hunger, the fear, and he shook with helpless rage. Letters from the daughters became his obsession. He began keeping a journal, copying each line as though writing it anew could somehow alter their fate. He read and reread each word, looking for hidden meanings, imagining despair in their pen strokes, and every sentence gnawed at him with fresh regret. The farm, once a sanctuary, now seemed like a mockery. Every field harvested, every fence mended, every crop thriving, all reminders of what his daughters could have had he made a different choice. The money, the security, the survival. It was all meaningless against the suffering he had unleashed. As winter returned for a second year, Thomas's health began to fail. The stress, the guilt, the unrelenting vision of the girl's suffering left him pale and hollow-eyed. Friends and neighbors whispered about his changed appearance, yet none understood the torment that lay beneath. The farm prospered, but Thomas could not enjoy it. Every creak of the barn, every shadow across the fields, reminded him of the price he had paid in his daughter's innocence and joy. And in the quiet of the night, when he could hear the wind rustling through the trees, he imagined their voices calling for him, asking why he had abandoned them. and he could not answer. The Caldwell household had become a labyrinth of fear and routine for Eliza and Margaret. Each morning, the girls were roused before dawn, the bitter air of Savannah slipping through the thin curtains, to greet them with a chill that seeped into their bones. Eliza moved slowly, still fragile from the previous year's illness, while Margaret, ever vigilant, guided her twin through the unrelenting chores. They polished silver, scrubbed floors, and tended the expansive gardens under the watchful eye of Mr. Caldwell's overseers, every misstep punished with a glare, a raised hand, or harsh words that echoed long after the sound faded. Fear had replaced laughter, and the girls began to measure every word, every motion, as though their lives depended on precision alone, which in truth they did. In the evenings, when the household quieted and shadows stretched along the walls, Margaret began to notice patterns. The servants whispered in hushed tones, exchanging stories of other children who had vanished or been sent to workhouses. She began asking discreet questions, piecing together information like a puzzle, learning the hidden rhythms of a household that claimed civility but operated on control, manipulation, and cruelty. Eliza, too weak to move with the same confidence, listened intently, relying on Margaret's sharp mind to navigate dangers they could barely articulate. The mansion, though grand, felt like a prison, each gilded corridor a reminder of the life stolen from them, a constant echo of the betrayal that Thomas had orchestrated. Meanwhile, Thomas's despair deepened. He no longer spoke to neighbors, no longer allowed himself the company of friends. Days merged into nights as he roamed the cotton fields, staring at the horizon where the Savannah road disappeared into the distance. Each letter from the girls brought a mixture of relief and torment. Eliza wrote cautiously, reporting on lessons learned and chores completed, while Margaret's words hinted at defiance, clever maneuvers to avoid punishment, small rebellions hidden beneath layers of obedience. Thomas read and reread them, his hands trembling, heart hammering against his ribs, guilt gnawing with relentless precision. He began to imagine every cruel act inflicted on the girls, every harsh word, every moment of fear, and the weight of his choice pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. One afternoon, Margaret discovered a hidden ledger in the Caldwell study. It detailed payments, contracts, and notes about the apprentices. Her heart raced as she realized the girls' names were listed with precise descriptions of their skills, obedience, and weaknesses. The ledger was a cold, meticulous record of children as property, stripped of humanity. She copied portions of it onto scraps of paper she tucked into her dress, a dangerous act of rebellion that could bring the wrath of Mr. Caldwell if discovered. She began to share this knowledge with Eliza in whispered tones, planning carefully, understanding that the smallest misstep could mean punishment worse than anything they had endured. Yet the act itself, the reclaiming of agency, gave them a fragile, flickering hope, a spark of resistance against the world their father had traded them into. Thomas, oblivious to the ledger yet increasingly consumed by obsession, began leaving small, almost frantic notes for the girls, hidden in the pockets of clothes he had sent, hoping they would find a trace of his love. Weeks passed without confirmation that they had received them. The uncertainty was unbearable, and he often imagined the worst. Eliza sick and ignored, Margaret punished for her cleverness, both suffering silently, each day reinforcing his regret. The money in the farm account felt meaningless, the fields lush but mocking. Even the harvest, which should have been a triumph, was a bitter reminder of what he had sacrificed. He had traded his daughter's safety for land and coin, and every living moment reminded him of the weight of that choice. Margaret's small acts of defiance continued. She learned to time chores to avoid the harshest overseers, to communicate with other children secretly, to memorize the household routines with an almost predatory precision. Eliza, fragile but determined, followed, trusting her sister to guide her through the perilous maze of obedience and punishment. Each day was a delicate dance. Every minor victory carried the thrill of survival and the terror of discovery. And yet, even in these small rebellions, the shadow of their father loomed large. Margaret often wondered why he had chosen money over them, why he had abandoned them to this life. The question haunted her nights and dreams, twisting into anger, fear, and sorrow. Thomas's health began to fail. The stress and constant guilt weighed heavily on him, manifesting in a persistent cough, sleepless nights, and a gaunt appearance that neighbors began to notice. He tried to keep busy, tending to the farm, inspecting crops, repairing fences, but nothing could drown out the images in his mind. Eliza's pale face, Margaret's trembling hands, the cold eyes of Mr. Caldwell watching over them. His obsession became almost tangible, a force that guided every action, every breath, every thought. He even began imagining confrontations he could never have, envisioning himself rescuing the girls, exposing the cruelty, undoing the past, though he knew deep down it was impossible. One evening, Margaret overheard a conversation between the Caldwell household manager and a visiting merchant. The discussion centered on profits, indentures, and the potential sale of apprentices to other households. Her heart leapt and sank at once. She realized that if she and Eliza were to survive, they could not remain passive. One evening, Margaret overheard a conversation between the Caldwell household manager and a visiting merchant. The discussion centered on profits, indentures, and the potential sale of apprentices to other households. Her heart leapt and sank at once. She realized that if she and Eliza were to survive, they could not remain passive. She began to plan more deliberately, observing every servant's pattern, the timing of Mr. Caldwell's movements, and even the smallest inconsistencies in supervision. The ledger she had discovered became a roadmap, each notation a clue toward survival or escape. She confided only in Eliza, careful to shield her from details that might overwhelm her sister. But their bond strengthened under the weight of shared adversity. Thomas, meanwhile, received yet another letter from Savannah, describing the girls' continued obedience, yet hinting at their resilience. Margaret's cleverness and Eliza's persistence were evident even through the terse words. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. The knowledge that the girls were surviving, that they were still human and strong, fairly tempered the bitter realization that he had set them on this path. Each word was a knife of both hope and regret, cutting deeper with every passing day. His nights became restless, haunted by dreams in which he walked through the Caldwell mansion, calling for his daughters, trying to shield them, only to be met with empty corridors and locked doors. Winter returned with its bitter winds, carrying with it a final reminder of Thomas's decision. A letter from the Caldwell estate described a minor incident. Eliza had fainted from exhaustion, and Margaret had been punished for attempting to help her. The words were clinical, stripped of compassion. Yet Thomas felt the full weight of the suffering they implied. He wandered the fields, hands gripping the fence, staring into the horizon where the Savannah road disappeared, and whispered apologies into the wind. The past, with all its mistakes, stretched before him as an endless void. He had traded love for survival, innocence for practicality, and every choice he had made now echoed back in relentless torment. Margaret, sensing the growing desperation in her sister, began teaching Eliza to be more vigilant, more calculated. Each day they learned which words could be spoken safely, which actions could be performed without drawing attention, and how to create the smallest windows of freedom within the oppressive mansion. Their bond became a shield against the cruelty imposed upon them, a fragile but unbreakable thread tying them together in a world designed to tear them apart. Yet even as they adapted, the shadow of Thomas's betrayal lingered, a constant reminder that the safety and comfort of childhood had been sacrificed for survival and greed. Thomas, consumed by his own regret, began keeping a journal, recording every letter, every imagined moment of cruelty, every pang of guilt. He walked the fields aimlessly, muttering apologies into the wind, replaying decisions over and over, wondering if there had been a single choice that could have spared them. Sleep became impossible. He dreamed of the girls wandering the mansion alone, faces pale with fear, hands grasping for him in vain. Each day he felt the weight of his decision grow heavier, until it pressed upon him like the relentless sun over the Georgia fields, unforgiving, unyielding, and inescapable. Spring arrived in Savannah with a deceptive softness. The streets glistened after rain. The air was thick with blooming jasmine. And yet the Caldwell mansion remained a prison for Eliza and Margaret. The mansion's walls, polished and imposing, reflected the sunlight with a cruel brilliance, mocking the girls as they moved silently through their chores. Each task carried hidden danger. An accidental misstep could bring the wrath of Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell, or the overseers. The twins had learned to read the moods of the household like an intricate map, anticipating punishment before it arrived, hiding small acts of defiance in shadows where no one dared look. Margaret's cunning had grown sharper. She began studying the patterns of servants, memorizing which hallways were unobserved and which rooms held the keys to doors and cabinets. One evening, as she carefully moved through the pantry, she overheard the staff discussing hidden ledgers and secret correspondence records that detailed not just apprentices but transactions, arrangements, and debts. Her mind raced. Each discovery was a piece of a puzzle she could use to reclaim agency over her life, a map to leverage against the household's cruelty. Eliza followed closely, fragile yet determined, trusting Margaret's judgment, relying on her twins' mind as they navigated a world designed to trap them. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitaker's guilt had grown into obsession. The farm prospered under his care, yet he could find no satisfaction in its abundance. Every harvest, every fence mended, every animal fed, only reminded him of the cost he had paid in his daughters' suffering. Letters arrived sporadically, each one a mixture of relief and renewed torment. Eliza's health, though improved, remained delicate, while Margaret's defiance, though clever, exposed them to escalating punishment. Thomas pored over the words, envisioning every reprimand, every act of cruelty, and each imagined consequence weighed on him like a physical burden. He had exchanged the safety and happiness of his daughters for survival, and the thought poisoned every moment of his days. One afternoon, Margaret discovered an opportunity. The servant, sympathetic and discreet, had left a small door, unlocked, that led to a narrow passage connecting the attic to the servants' quarters. She whispered the discovery to Eliza, who nodded silently, fear and excitement mingling in her eyes. This passage, if used cautiously, could allow them to communicate with other servants and gather information. It was a dangerous gamble, but Margaret's mind was set. Survival required risk, and she had learned that patience alone could not undo the cruelty imposed on them. Each step they took through the hidden corridors was measured, careful, silent, an act of defiance that sharpened their wits and strengthened their bond. Thomas, growing ever more desperate, began to wander the farm at odd hours, imagining the mansion and his daughters' plight as vividly as if he were standing inside those cold halls himself. He replayed his decision over and over, imagining alternatives that might have spared them pain. Sleep became impossible. Dreams were haunted by images of Eliza kneeling in punishment, Margaret hiding notes under her pillow, and Mr. Caldwell's piercing gaze. Every creak of the barn, every rustle of the trees, every distant call of a bird seemed to carry the echoes of their suffering. Regret, once a shadow, had become a constant companion, unrelenting and sharp. Then a twist came unexpectedly. A letter from a neighboring county reached Thomas, not from the girls, but from a former apprentice of the Caldwell household, someone who had escaped years earlier. The letter was brief but loaded with implications, tales of cruelty, confinement and secrets hidden in the mansion's records. The writer hinted that the Caldwell family's reputation had been built on manipulation and concealment, that children were often treated as property rather than human beings. Thomas read the letter in a daze, heart pounding, realizing that the danger to his daughters was far greater than he had imagined. The promise of education and security had been a facade masking calculated cruelty. Margaret, meanwhile, began to experiment with small acts of sabotage. She would misplace tools, rearrange objects, and leave subtle signs of resistance, each act a challenge to the authority that sought to crush her. Eliza watched with wide eyes, nervous but inspired by her sister's courage. The twins began to share whispered plans with other apprentices and sympathetic servants, weaving a network of knowledge and small rebellion within the mansion. Each secret message, each subtle defiance, was a fragile thread of hope that contrasted starkly with the oppressive walls surrounding them. Thomas's obsession intensified. He began keeping meticulous records of every letter, every imagined scenario, every pang of guilt, as though cataloguing his remorse could somehow make it bearable. He could not eat, could not sleep, could not focus on anything beyond the twin specters of Eliza and Margaret in his mind. The farm, once a source of pride, now felt like a tomb, a hollow reminder of the price he had paid. He imagined confronting Mr. Caldwell, exposing the cruelty, rescuing the girls, but he knew, deep down, that such fantasies were impossible. The reality of his betrayal pressed down on him relentlessly, each passing day a reminder that he had set them on a path lined with suffering. One stormy night, Margaret overheard a conversation that would change everything. Mr. Caldwell and the household manager discussed plans to sell one of the apprentices to another family for a profit, a fate that would separate the twins forever. Fear gripped her chest, sharp and immediate. But she did not hesitate. She began devising a plan to secure their safety, leveraging the knowledge she had gathered over months of careful observation. Each piece of information became a tool, each hidden corridor a potential escape route, each sympathetic servant a lifeline. The mansion, for all its grandeur, was vulnerable in ways Mr. Caldwell never anticipated. Thomas, at the same time, began to take desperate measures. He wrote letters not only to his daughters, but to distant relatives, attempting to gather support, warning them of the household's cruelty, seeking advice, any avenue that might allow him to intervene. The letters were often returned, delayed or ignored, yet he persisted, driven by an obsession that consumed every waking hour. He could not undo the past, could not erase the choice that had sent his daughters into this world of suffering, but he could try to influence their future, even from afar. The weight of his regret was a living thing, gnawing at his chest, twisting every thought, shaping every action. Margaret's plans grew bolder as the months passed. She began leaving notes for the girls' distant relatives, hinting at the conditions in the Caldwell household and urging them to intervene. Eliza, inspired by her sister's bravery, contributed small observations, details that could aid their rescue. The mansion, imposing and cold, began to feel less omnipotent in the face of their combined ingenuity. Yet every step carried immense risk. Discovery could mean punishment far worse than any they had endured, but the prospect of remaining passive, trapped under Mr. Caldwell's control indefinitely, was unthinkable. Thomas's despair reached a fevered pitch. He could no longer focus on the farm, on the seasons, on the life he had fought so hard to preserve. Every sound, every shadow, every creak in the house seemed to carry the voice of his daughters, a reminder of the life he had compromised. His nights were sleepless, filled with visions of the mansion, the girls' frightened faces, and the consequences of his betrayal. Each day brought a new wave of guilt, sharper than the last, until he felt physically crushed by the weight of his own decisions. The farm prospered, but the prosperity was meaningless. The price of survival had been a lifetime of torment for his children, and no measure of money or success could reconcile the choice he had made. By the end of the year, the stage was set for confrontation. Margaret's network of secret information and small acts of defiance had grown sufficiently strong to create opportunities. Thomas, consumed by obsession and regret, had prepared for intervention in any form possible. The mansion, once an unyielding symbol of power and cruelty, now had cracks. And as the twins lay awake at night, whispering plans and dreams of freedom, the audience could sense that the first threads of justice, revelation and exposure were beginning to take shape. The slow burn of suspense, built over years of suffering and meticulous observation, was reaching a tipping point. The mansion seemed quieter than usual that morning, but Eliza and Margaret knew better than to trust appearances. Years of strict discipline had taught them that silence often preceded punishment, that the calmest moments were frequently traps designed to test vigilance. Margaret had spent the previous nights carefully observing patterns, noting which rooms were unlocked, when the servants shifted their duties, and when Mr. Caldwell took his afternoon walks on the estate grounds. Each observation became a thread in a carefully woven plan, the tapestry of their subtle rebellion growing stronger, more deliberate with every passing day. Eliza followed her sister's lead, fragile yet determined, her body still recovering from the previous winter's illness. She trusted Margaret implicitly, allowing her twin to guide each move, to signal when to speak and when to remain silent. Each step through the mansion was measured, each word weighed for consequence. They moved like shadows, invisible yet ever-present, absorbing every detail, every pattern, every small inconsistency that could be exploited. The mansion, grand and imposing, had weaknesses they could use, and Margaret intended to find them all. Thomas Whitaker, meanwhile, had descended into a state of near obsession. Each day he rose before dawn, walking the cotton fields aimlessly, imagining the mansion and his daughter's plight as vividly as if he were there. He had written countless letters, sent parcels of clothing and notes hidden in pockets. Yet he feared none of it reached them, or if it did, that it could protect them from the cruelty of the Caldwell household. Sleep had abandoned him months ago, replaced by nightmares in which Eliza and Margaret were lost forever, punished beyond his ability to intervene. The farm thrived under his hands, yet prosperity brought no comfort. Each bountiful crop, each sturdy fence, reminded him of the children's suffering he had sanctioned. Then came the first tangible break in the girls' careful strategy. One afternoon, while Margaret was observing the household manager's routines, she noticed a servant, an older woman with a soft heart and quiet courage, discreetly signaling with small gestures. The woman had witnessed enough cruelty to sympathize, to understand the twins' plight. Margaret approached cautiously, whispering the need for secrecy, explaining that their father had attempted to protect them from afar and that every small act of rebellion now was crucial. The servant nodded, offering subtle assistance, leaving doors slightly ajar, delivering small notes, providing guidance for navigating the mansion's most perilous corridors. Margaret and Eliza felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by fear. Each interaction with the ally was a calculated risk, a delicate balance of trust and caution. Discovery could mean immediate punishment, or worse, permanent separation. Yet the alternative, passivity, submission, and continued cruelty, was unthinkable. Slowly, deliberately, they began expanding their network of information, using small signs, whispered messages, and clever timing to coordinate actions that would later allow them to reclaim some measure of agency over their lives. Thomas's letters had begun to reflect his increasing desperation. He wrote of apologies, of imagined interventions, and of fervent hope that his daughters might find the strength to survive. Each letter, carefully folded and tucked into parcels, was a plea, a silent promise that he had never abandoned them entirely in spirit, even if his actions had caused their suffering. He imagined the girls reading his words in secret, holding on to them as a lifeline, though he could not know if they ever received them. The uncertainty gnawed at him relentlessly, each day a fresh torment of guilt and longing. Margaret's observations extended to Mr. Caldwell himself. She noted his habitual strolls along the garden path, the precise timing of his meals, the rare moments when his attention wandered elsewhere. She memorized the patterns, using them to orchestrate small diversions, moving through spaces unobserved, slipping notes to allies, and plotting subtle acts of sabotage. Eliza, her body still fragile, followed closely, learning to remain invisible, to anticipate danger, to trust her sister's judgment implicitly. Together, they formed a silent, invisible force within the mansion, gathering knowledge, allies, and courage for the decisive moment that would come. Thomas's obsession reached a fevered pitch as he learned from a letter from the escaped apprentice that the Caldwell household had a long history of exploiting children, of concealing cruelty behind polite facades and meticulous ledgers. The realization struck him like a physical blow. The girls were trapped in a system designed to break them, and every day he delayed intervention. Every decision he had made to secure his own survival had compounded their suffering. His thoughts became all-consuming. The very air seemed to carry their pain. He walked the fields, muttering apologies into the wind, imagining scenarios in which he could confront Caldwell, rescue the girls, undo the consequences of his choices. But deep down, he knew he was powerless, and the realization pressed on him with unbearable weight. Margaret and Eliza, meanwhile, began to recognize small victories. Notes passed through sympathetic servants reached distant relatives. Alerts sent discreetly into the world beyond the mansion's walls. They learned of Thomas' letters and of the concern being quietly raised on their behalf. The knowledge offered a fragile hope. The outside world, the family who had not abandoned them entirely, was watching, ready to intervene if the opportunity arose. Each success was measured, cautious and tiny, but it infused them with a sense of agency they had never felt in the Caldwell household. Tension reached its apex when a harsh reprimand was issued over a minor error. Margaret had miscalculated the timing of chores by mere minutes, and Mr. Caldwell's anger was swift and precise. He barked orders, threatened punishment, and for a brief moment, the twins feared all their careful planning had been undone. But the ally servant remained discreetly supportive, signaling Margaret to remain calm, to endure, and to continue with patience. It was a delicate balance of courage and prudence, teaching the girls that survival required not just intellect and cunning, but resilience in the face of immediate danger. Thomas, sensing the growing peril, intensified his efforts. He consulted distant contacts, wrote letters filled with guidance and warnings, and attempted to influence allies who could reach the girls. His guilt, sharpened by knowledge of the ledger and the previous letters, became almost tangible, a living force driving him toward action. Every moment of inaction felt like a direct contribution to the cruelty. Every success of the girls a faint balm for the wounds of his conscience. He could not undo the past, but he desperately sought to mitigate the suffering his decisions had wrought. Margaret's subtle maneuvers eventually revealed a critical vulnerability in the mansion structure. A narrow, seldom-used service stairwell leading to the outer gardens. Overlooked by all but the most attentive overseers, she shared the discovery with Eliza, outlining how it could serve as a hidden route to communicate with the outside world, a lifeline that might enable contact with relatives or allies who could intervene. The girls practiced movement timing and signals in whispered secrecy, perfecting their strategy, understanding that even the smallest misstep could lead to punishment or permanent separation. As drew to a close, the twins' quiet rebellion had evolved into a carefully constructed plan, leveraging intelligence, observation, and secrecy to create opportunities for escape or exposure. Thomas's obsession and regret reached its most acute stage, consuming every waking hour, every thought, every action. The stage was set for confrontation, for revelation, for the reckoning of choices made in desperation and cruelty. Every moment carried tension, the slow burn of suspense ready to ignite as the final threads of betrayal, ingenuity, and survival converged. The oppressive summer heat had settled over Savannah, thick and unrelenting, but for Eliza and Margaret it carried a quiet promise. Months of observation, whispered plans, and careful networking with sympathetic servants had coalesced into a single, dangerous opportunity. Margaret's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the hallways one last time, memorizing patrol patterns, timing of meals, and the faintest of signals from their ally. Eliza, frail but determined, followed closely, their bond a lifeline amid the looming threat of discovery. Every step, every breath was measured. The mansion's grandeur now a map of vulnerabilities rather than power. That night, under the cloak of darkness, the twins moved. They slipped through the narrow service stairwell Margaret had discovered, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The air smelled of jasmine and damp stone, the faint rustle of leaves outside offering cover for their movements. Each sound, a distant creak of a door, the murmur of a servant, a whisper of wind against the walls, was both danger and signal. They communicated silently, fingers tracing subtle marks, eyes locking in understanding that only years of shared hardship could produce. Every moment was a test of nerve, patience, and courage. A single misstep could mean the end of their plan and a punishment far worse than any they had endured. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitaker paced his farm in Georgia, restlessness and obsession consuming him. News had arrived via a trusted intermediary, their coded message that the twins were poised to act, to seize control of the smallest chance for freedom. Thomas's chest tightened with both hope and terror. He had spent years in regret, every decision haunted by the cruelty he had sanctioned, every prosperous harvest a bitter reminder of their suffering. Now, as the possibility of reunion and justice drew near, he feared failure, feared the consequences if the twins were discovered before their plan could succeed. His guilt, once a shadow, had become a living force, shaping every thought, every breath, every movement. Back in the mansion, Margaret and Eliza navigated hidden passages and service corridors, every motion calculated, every glance alert for danger. The mansion, so imposing in daylight, seemed vulnerable at night, its grandeur masking the cracks in its control. The twins slipped letters to allies, signaling their intentions, creating diversions, and exploiting every weakness they had discovered. Eliza, despite her fragility, moved with quiet determination, her trust in Margaret unwavering. Each corridor traversed, each door passed was a triumph, but also a reminder of the stakes. Capture would mean not just punishment, but the permanent fracturing of the bond that had sustained them through years of cruelty. Thomas's letters, long ignored or delayed, now carried critical guidance. Hidden in a parcel delivered by a sympathetic servant, instructions and warnings were passed along, creating a lifeline from father to daughters. Thomas imagined their hands trembling as they read his words, imagining the spark of hope that allowed them to persist. Yet each moment of imagined triumph was tempered by fear, fear that the household would discover their defiance, that the careful balance of secrecy could collapse under a single misstep. The weight of his choices, of the decision to trade their freedom for survival, pressed upon him as heavily as it had since the day he had signed their fate away. The night deepened, shadows thickening in the hallways of the Caldwell mansion. Margaret led Eliza through corridors and hidden stairwells, communicating silently with allies positioned strategically. The sound of their footsteps was muted, their breathing controlled, every motion rehearsed. The mansion's oppressive authority, which had seemed absolute, now revealed subtle vulnerabilities, gaps in oversight, and moments of human error that could be exploited. The twins had learned patience, observation, and cunning, skills forged in cruelty and necessity. Each calculated movement brought them closer to a chance at agency, a chance to reclaim their lives from the machinery of exploitation that had held them captive for years. Thomas waited, pacing the farm as the hours passed, imagining every possible scenario. He envisioned the girls being discovered, punished, or worse. He envisioned their successful escape, imagining the moment he would see them again, free from the oppression of the Caldwell household. The duality of hope and terror tore at him, yet he could not cease. Inaction was impossible. Every creak of the farmhouse, every wind in the trees, seemed to carry their presence and his failure simultaneously. His body shook with anticipation, his mind consumed with the narrow margins between disaster and reunion. At the mansion, Margaret reached the final obstacle, a locked gate separating the twins from the outer gardens, and the first true breath of freedom. She had anticipated this, having secretly acquired a key from an unwitting servant days earlier. Her hands trembled as she inserted it into the lock, aware that discovery at this moment would be catastrophic. Eliza stood close, eyes wide, trusting her sister implicitly, feeling the culmination of years of suffering, fear and cautious planning in this single act. The key turned with a quiet click, the gate swinging open, revealing the dimly lit garden beyond, a world that was theirs to navigate if only they could escape unseen. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of wet earth and summer flowers. The twins moved quickly but carefully, guided by moonlight and the distant sounds of the city beyond the estate walls. Every moment was tense, every shadow a potential threat. Margaret whispered directions, Eliza followed, and the years of hardship, observation, and subtle rebellion culminated in a quiet but powerful momentum toward freedom. They had endured cruelty, confinement, and the betrayal of a father's choice. Yet in this moment, their courage and cunning were about to reclaim their lives. Thomas's anticipation reached its peak as he received a coded message from an intermediary that the twins had successfully exited the mansion grounds. Relief washed over him in a way that felt almost physical. Tears blurring his vision, he imagined the girls running toward him. The reconciliation, the weight of years of guilt, lifting in a single moment of reunion. Yet even in this fleeting hope, regret remained, a sharp reminder that the suffering endured could never be erased, that the cost of survival had been borne in their childhoods and his conscience. The following morning, the Caldwell household erupted in confusion and fury. The twins' disappearance was discovered. Letters, secret passages, and the ledger, all revealing layers of manipulation and cruelty. Mr. Caldwell's authority, long perceived as unassailable, crumbled under scrutiny and exposure. Servants whispered, neighbors speculated, and the truth of years of calculated oppression began to surface. Margaret's careful planning had not only secured their immediate safety, but also ensured that the household's cruelty would face accountability. Each revelation carried satisfaction, tempered by the bitter knowledge of all that had been endured. Reunited at last, Thomas embraced his daughters, a mixture of joy, relief, and enduring guilt washing over him. The farm, once a source of wealth and security, now felt secondary to the immeasurable value of his children's safety and agency. He wept openly, pressing them to his chest, silently apologizing for every day of suffering, every cruel consequence of his choice. Eliza and Margaret, though scarred by their experiences, clung to him. The bond between father and daughters reaffirmed even amid the shadows of betrayal and cruelty. The aftermath brought reflection, reckoning, and a slow return to normalcy. Thomas, forever marked by regret, vowed never to let survival come at the expense of those he loved again. The twins, having endured years of calculated oppression, began to heal, their resilience forged in the crucible of hardship, their bond strengthened by shared suffering and triumph. The Caldwell household faced scrutiny, consequences, and a tarnished legacy, the echoes of their cruelty forever documented by letters, ledgers, and the courage of the twins who refused to be broken. In the quiet of the farm, as the sun set over Georgia, Thomas stood with Eliza and Margaret, watching the fields stretch into the horizon. The air was warm, filled with the scent of earth and life. And yet the memory of choices, suffering, and years of regret lingered like a shadow. He spoke softly, words of apology and love blending with the hum of cicadas and the rustle of trees. "I will never forgive myself for what I did," he admitted, "but I promise to spend every day making it right in the only way I can. From here, with you." The twins nodded, understanding the depth of his regret, while knowing that their resilience, courage, and ingenuity had rewritten their fates. And as the night deepened, they stood together, a family reunited yet forever changed, the scars of cruelty and betrayal etched into memory, but hope and survival prevailing. They had endured darkness, endured cruelty, and endured regret, but in their reunion, in their resilience, they found the power to reclaim their lives. Their story, filled with suffering and human cruelty, became a testament to survival, courage, and the enduring strength of family, even when betrayal had threatened to shatter it. Finally, Thomas looked at his daughters, his voice breaking, and added a quiet request. "Stay together, trust each other, and always remember the strength you carry." And with that, the family remained united, the past's cruelty acknowledged, the weight of regret borne as a lesson, and the promise of a future built on courage and vigilance, free from the chains of prior mistakes. If you are watching this story, remember the consequences of choices, the burden of betrayal, and the power of resilience. Like the twins and their father, every decision shapes not only your life, but the lives of those you love. Don't let cruelty define your legacy. Please, if this story moved you, like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales that reveal the depths of human nature, regret, and survival.